I still remember the exact moment my parents handed my sister a check for $100,000 like it was a birthday card. Like it was normal. Like I wasn't standing right there watching my entire childhood finally make sense in the worst possible way. It happened in their living room, the same living room where family photos covered the walls, except most of them were of her. Graduation pictures, dance recitals, her smiling face frozen in time at every stage of her perfect little life. I was in maybe 2 of those photos, and both of them looked like accidents, like someone had realized halfway through framing the shot that they had another daughter. My sister, Emily, squealed when she opened the envelope. "Oh my God, Mom, Dad, are you serious?" My mom laughed in that soft, proud voice she only ever used with Emily. "Of course we're serious, honey. You and Mark deserve a real start, a real home." Emily's husband, Mark, wrapped an arm around her waist and smiled politely toward my parents, then glanced at me like I was just furniture in the room. I had gotten used to that look over the years. I specialized in being ignored. Emily looked at the check again, her eyes shining. $100,000. This is insane. Dad leaned back in his recliner, crossing his arms like he had just solved world hunger. "It's an investment in your future." I remember swallowing slowly because my throat suddenly felt like sandpaper. I had come over that afternoon because Mom told me she wanted to talk about family matters. I thought, stupidly, maybe it had something to do with the land. I cleared my throat carefully. "That's really generous." Mom nodded quickly, like she appreciated my attempt to be polite, but her attention snapped right back to Emily. "You've worked so hard," she told her. "You deserve stability." I stared at the carpet, tracing the faded floral pattern with my eyes, trying to figure out when Emily had ever struggled financially. She and Mark both had corporate jobs, 2 incomes, no student loans, no setbacks. Their biggest hardship was deciding between vacation destinations every summer. Meanwhile, I had spent the last 8 years building a landscaping business from scratch. I worked 12-hour days, I drove a truck that rattled every time I turned left, I paid off my student debt alone, I lived in a tiny rental duplex with peeling paint and a landlord who ignored repair calls. But apparently, stability was something Emily needed help with. Dad suddenly looked at me like he had just remembered I existed. "You're being awfully quiet." I forced a smile. "Just surprised, I guess." He shrugged. "Life isn't always fair." The words hit harder than they should have, probably because they weren't new. They were just louder now. Emily hugged Mom tightly, then Dad, and everyone started talking about mortgage rates and neighborhoods and school districts like this was the most natural conversation in the world. I sat there listening to them plan a future I had never been offered, feeling like I was watching someone else's family through a window. After a few minutes, Mom turned to me suddenly, like she remembered something important. "Oh, sweetheart, about you." My stomach tightened. "We've been meaning to talk to you about expectations," she said gently, the same tone people use when explaining bad news to children. Dad leaned forward. "You've always been independent." There was that word again, independent. It sounded positive, but in our family it translated to "you're on your own." "I've managed," I said quietly. Dad nodded once. "Exactly. That's why we never worried about you the way we worry about Emily." Emily frowned slightly. "Dad," but she didn't actually stop him. "You've always been strong," he continued. "You don't need handouts." I felt heat creeping up my neck. "So this isn't about helping children, it's about helping her?" Mom sighed like I was making things uncomfortable. "Honey, Emily has responsibilities, a family to think about." "I could have had a family too," I said before I could stop myself. The room went silent. Mark shifted awkwardly. Emily stared at the floor. Dad's voice hardened. "You made different choices." I almost laughed at that. I made different choices? I worked 2 jobs through college while Emily studied abroad in Italy on my parents' credit card. Mom reached for my hand, but I pulled it back slightly. "You're not a failure," she quickly said. The fact that she needed to clarify that felt worse than if she had just said nothing. But, Dad added like he couldn't help himself, you didn't exactly follow the path we imagined. I stared at him. You mean the path where I married rich and stayed close for Sunday dinners? That's not fair, Mom whispered. I stood up slowly, feeling my heartbeat pounding in my ears. You know what's funny? I didn't come here expecting money. I came here because I thought maybe we were finally going to talk about the land. Dad's jaw tightened. Emily looked up quickly. What land? The question hung in the air like broken glass. Mom looked at Dad nervously. Dad exhaled sharply and leaned back again. The land is hers, he said flatly. Emily blinked. What land? I crossed my arms, suddenly realizing she genuinely didn't know. Grandpa's land, the 20 acres outside River Glen. Emily's eyes widened. Wait, the farm property? Not a farm anymore, just undeveloped land. Emily looked between our parents, confused. You gave that to her? Mom nodded slowly. Years ago. Emily's expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe calculation. That land is valuable, Mark said quietly. Dad shrugged. It's raw property, needs work. I watched Emily processing the information, watched her brain turning behind her perfect smile. She looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. You still own it? She asked. Yes. She nodded slowly, then smiled again, but something about it felt different, sharper. The way she said it made my stomach twist. I left not long after that. The congratulations and thank yous continued behind me as I walked out the front door. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody asked if I was okay. I drove home gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands cramped. That night, I sat on the back steps of my duplex, staring at the darkness and thinking about that land. 20 acres of uneven ground, wild grass, and old fencing, but it was the only thing in my life that had ever been given to me without conditions. Or at least, I thought it was. 3 weeks later, Emily called me for the first time in months. I was trimming hedges outside a client's house when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it until I saw her name flashing across the screen. Hey, I answered cautiously. Her voice sounded sweet, too sweet. Hi, sis, are you busy? I'm working. Oh, I'll be quick. I just wanted to talk about the land. There was that word again, land. What about it? I asked. Well, Mark and I were talking and we realized something. She paused dramatically. That property could actually help both of us. I blinked slowly, convinced I had misheard her. Split the money? She said like it was obvious. Yeah, it was Grandpa's land. It belongs to the family. I legally transferred it. She laughed lightly. Legally, sure, but emotionally, it's shared history. I felt my chest tighten. Emily, you just got $100,000 from Mom and Dad. That's different, she said quickly. That was for a house. This is generational property. I stared across the manicured lawn in front of me, trying to keep my voice steady. So you want me to sell the only thing they ever gave me and give you half? It's not like that, she insisted. It's about fairness. The word fairness echoed in my head like a joke that wasn't funny. I'm not selling the land, I said quietly. Her voice dropped. You're being selfish. I closed my eyes. I'm protecting something that matters to me. It matters to all of us, she snapped. No, it matters to you now that you know it exists. There was a long silence on the line. Finally, she said, Mom and Dad won't be happy about this. My stomach sank slightly, but I kept my voice calm. It's not their decision. You'd rather choose dirt over your family? She asked coldly. I looked out at the street, watching cars pass by, wondering when dirt had become the only thing in my life that felt stable. Yes, I said softly. She hung up without another word. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call was the first domino, and by the time the last one fell, the land wouldn't just divide my family, it would destroy it.
The line went dead, but I kept holding the phone against my ear like I could still hear her breathing on the other side, like maybe she would come back and say she didn't mean it. The hedge trimmer buzzed softly beside me, forgotten, while my chest felt like someone had packed it with wet sand. I knew Emily. She didn't let things go. She smiled through them until she figured out how to win. The rest of that workday blurred into muscle memory. I finished the yard, loaded my equipment, and drove home through late afternoon traffic, my thoughts replaying every word she had said. By the time I pulled into the cracked driveway of my duplex, I already had 3 missed calls, all from Mom. I sat in the truck staring at the screen, debating whether to call back or just pretend my phone had died. But I knew how this worked. Silence in our family was treated like guilt, so I hit dial before I could change my mind. She answered immediately. "Why are you fighting with your sister?" I exhaled slowly. No hello, no how are you, straight to battle. "I'm not fighting with her," I said. "She asked me to sell my land and give her half." Mom sighed dramatically, like I had just confessed to kicking a puppy. "She wasn't asking like that." "That's exactly how she asked," I replied. "She's stressed. Buying a house is overwhelming. You know how expensive everything is right now." I rubbed my temple. "She has $100,000 from you and Dad." "That money is already allocated," she said quickly. Allocated. Like Emily was a corporate project and I was a canceled budget line. "Mom," I said carefully, "that land is the only inheritance Grandpa left me." "You're acting like we've never supported you," she said sharply. I almost laughed. It bubbled up in my throat before turning into something bitter. "When?" "You lived here rent-free after college for 6 months." "I paid you back," I said quietly. She ignored that. "You've always been difficult about family sharing." I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the peeling laminate. Sharing usually means both people give something. "She's your sister," Mom snapped. "And I'm your daughter." The silence after that felt heavier than anything she had said before. I could almost hear her weighing words, deciding how far she wanted to push. Finally, she said, softer, "Emily thinks you resent her." I swallowed. "That's convenient." "Do you?" she asked. The question landed deeper than I expected. I thought about the photos on their wall, the vacations, the college funds, the way Emily's mistakes were called phases, while mine were called failures. "I resent how different the rules have always been," I admitted. Mom's voice cooled instantly. "Your father is very disappointed in your attitude." There it was, the final stamp of parental judgment. "I didn't do anything wrong," I said. "You're tearing the family apart over land." "No," I replied quietly. "The family is trying to take the only thing that was ever mine." She didn't respond. She just hung up. I stood in my kitchen staring at the silent phone, feeling like I had just watched a bridge collapse behind me. For the next few days, nothing happened. No calls, no messages. The silence stretched long enough that I almost convinced myself it was over, that maybe they had accepted my decision and moved on. Then Saturday morning came. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when someone started pounding on my front door. Not knocking, pounding. The sound echoed through the thin walls like a warning. I opened it to find my parents standing on my tiny front porch. Dad's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching in his cheek. Mom stood beside him with her arms folded like she was bracing herself for disappointment. I stepped aside automatically. "You could have called." Dad walked in without answering, scanning the apartment like he was inspecting a crime scene. "This place is still falling apart." "Good morning to you too," I muttered. Mom sat on the couch, her posture stiff. Dad remained standing, looming in the center of the living room like he owned the space. "We need to settle this," he said. I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. "There's nothing to settle." "You're selling the land," he replied flatly. The certainty in his voice made my stomach drop. "I'm not selling it." "You don't understand the bigger picture." "I understand perfectly," I answered. Mom jumped in quickly. "Emily and Mark have already spoken with a realtor about developing that property." I blinked. "What?" "It could be turned into housing lots. Huge profit potential. For the family." I laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You mean for them?" "For everyone," Mom insisted. "I'm not interested." Dad stepped closer.
That land was never meant to isolate you from your family. I was given it to me, legally, specifically, by Grandpa. Dad's eyes darkened. Your grandfather expected you to use it wisely. I am. By letting it sit there growing weeds, he snapped. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and steady. By keeping the only thing in my life that wasn't handed to someone else first. Mom stood up suddenly. Why are you being so stubborn? Why are you acting like it's not mine? I shot back. Dad pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto my coffee table. This is property tax documentation. I stared at the paper but didn't touch it. What is that? Property tax documentation, he said. That land still has family ties attached to it. My pulse started racing. What does that mean? It means, he said slowly, ownership can be complicated. I grabbed the paper, scanning it quickly, my eyes catching legal terms that made my throat tighten. There were references to shared easements, old family access rights, language I barely understood. You never mentioned this. Mom looked away. Dad folded his arms. We didn't think it would become necessary. My hands trembled slightly as I held the paper. Are you threatening to challenge my ownership? We're trying to resolve this peacefully, he replied. That sounds like a yes. Mom stepped closer, her voice soft again, almost pleading. Sweetheart, just think about how much easier life would be if you cooperated. I looked around my tiny apartment, the mismatched furniture, the cracked ceiling, the life I had built alone from nothing, and suddenly I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not sadness. Clarity. I'm not selling, I said firmly. Dad stared at me like he didn't recognize the person standing in front of him. You're making a huge mistake. Maybe, but it's mine to make. The room fell silent again. Mom pressed her lips together, her eyes glossy with frustration. Dad picked up his keys slowly, like each movement required effort. You think independence makes you strong. It makes you alone. I didn't answer. They left without another word, the door clicking shut behind them like a final verdict. I stood there staring at the door, my hands still shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. Something told me this wasn't the end, not even close. I didn't know yet that they had already taken the next step. And I definitely didn't know that in less than 2 weeks, someone would show up at my land with a clipboard, a measuring wheel, and documents that would make me question whether I had ever truly owned it at all.
The man with the clipboard didn't even look nervous when I pulled my truck onto the dirt edge of my land and stepped out. He just kept rolling his measuring wheel across the dry grass like he'd done it 100 times before. The late afternoon sun stretched his shadow across Grandpa's old fence line. The same fence he built with his own hands when I was 8 and still believed families stayed together forever. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing on my property?" He stopped, glanced at me, and flipped a page on his clipboard. "Survey confirmation." "Authorized by who?" I asked. He hesitated, just slightly. Then he said, "Development planning request." My chest tightened. By who? He checked his paperwork again like he already knew the answer but didn't want to say it out loud. Emily Carter and Mark Donnelly. The world didn't crash. It didn't explode. It just went quiet in that slow, suffocating way where every sound feels far away. Even the wind felt like it had stopped moving. "These people don't own this land," I said. "I'm not here to confirm ownership," he replied politely, "just marking preliminary measurements." I walked closer, my boots crunching over dry gravel. "You need to leave." He studied me for a second, then nodded slowly. "Ma'am, I don't argue with property disputes. I just follow contracts, but I'll note your objection." He packed his measuring wheel, climbed into his truck, and drove away, leaving thin tire tracks slicing across the entrance to the field like scars that weren't supposed to be there.
I stood alone for a long time after that, staring at the empty stretch of land that had always felt like the only place in the world where I wasn't compared to someone else, wasn't measured, wasn't judged. It was just mine. Or at least, I thought it was. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying Dad's voice. Ownership can be complicated. The sentence echoed in my head like a warning I should have taken more seriously. Monday morning, I called the attorney whose name Grandpa had written inside an old envelope tucked in his toolbox years ago. I never thought I'd need it. I barely remembered the man, just that Grandpa trusted him enough to say, if anything ever gets messy, you call him before you call family. His office smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner, and he listened without interrupting while I explained everything. Emily's demand, my parents' visit, the surveyor. When I finished, he leaned back slowly and folded his hands. "Your grandfather expected this," he said. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He opened a thick folder and slid it across the desk toward me. Inside were copies of the land transfer documents, but also additional paperwork I had never seen before. He knew there would be pressure, he continued. That's why he structured the transfer with layered protections. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding harder with every paragraph filled with legal language I struggled to fully understand. They can challenge access easements, but they cannot force a sale, and they cannot develop the land without your full consent. Your grandfather made that very clear. I exhaled shakily, relief hitting me so hard my hands started trembling. "But," he added quietly, my breath caught. "But what?" "They can make your life very difficult," he said honestly. "Legal challenges, access disputes, tax pressure, family conflicts can last years." I stared down at the paperwork, running my fingers over Grandpa's signature at the bottom of one page. The ink looked faded, but steady, confident, like he knew I would eventually be sitting here reading it. "Did he say anything else?" I asked. The lawyer smiled faintly. He said, "You would probably underestimate yourself, and that I should remind you he didn't." Something inside my chest cracked open at that. For the next few weeks, everything escalated exactly the way the lawyer warned. Letters arrived, notices, technical complaints about driveway access and irrigation lines that had existed peacefully for decades. Mom stopped calling completely. Dad sent one message that just said, "You've chosen your path." And maybe I had. One evening near sunset, I drove back out to the land alone. The sky was painted in dusty orange streaks, and the air smelled like dry earth and distant rain that never quite reached this part of the county. I walked along the fence line until I reached the old oak tree where Grandpa used to sit and drink iced tea while pretending not to watch me chase grasshoppers. The bark was rough beneath my palm, familiar, real, solid in a way family suddenly didn't feel anymore. For the first time, the silence around me didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. I realized I wasn't standing there trying to prove anything to Emily or my parents or anyone. I was standing there because this land was proof that someone in my life had seen me clearly, without comparison, without disappointment, without conditions. It was just mine. Or at least I thought it was. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting another legal notice or passive-aggressive message. It was from an unknown number. Just one sentence. "You think this is over." I stared at the screen as the last strip of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, shadows stretching longer across the field, across the fence, across everything Grandpa had left behind. I didn't respond. I just slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked out across the land, knowing some battles don't end with victory or defeat, they just change shape and wait for the next season. And standing there in the fading light, I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about who I was allowed to be. even if it meant standing alone while everyone else kept measuring my worth in ways I refused to understand.